Good evening and good afternoon. This is Jim Gerson from CareStack. You're in the right place. Hosted by Hendrik Lai on the anatomy of a transaction from financing to closing the deal. I want to just remind everyone, this is the fourth installment of our series. We've gotten great feedback, both from people who've attended live and then also watched the recordings. And then one other thing I did want to mention, and Hendrik, if you want to advance the slide, I'll give a quick introduction on CareStack. As you can see from your screen here, CareStack is a 100% cloud-based solution for the complete management of the contemporary dental practice. And we typically find ourselves working with two types of groups or DSOs. The first is growing, having success, they're ambitious. They see technology as giving themselves a competitive advantage, and they're just not sure how to get there. They need a little bit of help. The second type of practice is unfortunately not having that kind of success. That group is frustrated and aggravated from either managing a multitude of subscriptions that bolt on top of their legacy software, or their insurance system is broken and they can't give accurate estimates at the time of treatments. In either case, sleepless nights result for the owners. Maybe they're pulling their hair out. And if you find yourselves falling into one of these two categories, please consider learning more about CareStack. Go to our website, carestack.com, and book a demo so you can learn a little bit more about CareStack. Thanks for hearing me out. Now I'm going to turn over to Andrea for an introduction on Darby Dental, who's our other sponsor this evening, and introduce our panelists and our facilitator. So Andrea, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Jim. Good evening, everyone. I am Andrea Height, the Division Director for the newly developed DSO division with Darby Dental. We're very excited to be partnered with CareStack because we appreciate how many challenges practices and emerging DSOs are dealing with, and they seem to change daily. So we're here to bring solutions, to listen to you and look at different ways we can help you reach your goals and your mission. And part of that this evening is this wonderful presentation. So I would like to make introductions to our presenters. Firstly, we have Brandon Finazzo, who has worked in the healthcare industry since 2008. To me, that makes him a baby, but I realize that means he's got lots of experience. He has over a decade in commercial lending and credit experience. He's currently the head of practice solutions at Panacea Financial, where he oversees the national commercial footprint and manages the respective sales teams. Previously, he had positions at Wells Fargo Bank Healthcare Industries Group, Citi Practice Finance Group, and US Bank. Brandon has a passion for connecting with students to assist them with preparation for practice ownership, which I know they absolutely need, having spoken myself with many students. So that resonates. He lives in New Braunfels, Texas, with his wife Shannon, 8-month-old daughter Sophia, and his dogs Callie and Chloe. And he enjoys fly fishing, which I hate. I like ocean fishing. He likes pheasant hunting and traveling. All right, so now it is my next pleasure to introduce Chip Fitchner, who is the founder of Large Practice Sales. He is a serial entrepreneur for over 40 years, which means from his photo, he probably started at age 7 or 8. He's bought and sold dozens of businesses. He is the chairman of and CEO of multiple public companies, presented globally on economics, marketing, and practice monetization since 1982. He has a tolerant wife of 31 years. He's a boataholic, and he resides on Southwest Airlines. Yeah, I used to have a condo on Delta, so I completely understand that as well. So we are delighted to have both of your expertise this evening. And then lastly, our moderator is Dr. Hendrik Lai. He and I are both from Australia, which explains our good looks and personalities. We also both attended the same dental school, though in totally different decades, mine preceding his by a lot. But anyway, Hendrik has sat in every chair in the office, and he really understands the struggle and balance professional obligations placed on healers with both the care, the commercial and operational realities of being business owners. He knows how to help practices realize their vision, address the goals that they want to achieve, and find ways to be successful in meaningful ways to them. Hendrik received his dental degree from the University of Adelaide, and he has an EMBA MS Business Analytics and Organizational Leadership qualifications. And he is a chartered management consultant and certified manager, and a fellow of the Institute of Managers and Leaders for the National Institute of Directors and Managers. And the list goes on. I mean, what we have here is a trio of overachievers, and I'm going to now turn the time over to Hendrik, our overachieving moderator, to get the show on the road.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Really appreciate that very, very warm introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening or afternoon, depending on where you are. So I'd like to sort of just begin to kick off the presentation with an understanding that we have an audience that are at different levels or different stages within their growth of their businesses. You know, some are just starting out, some are single doctor locations that are considering maybe a sale to a DSO. There are some that are groups that are looking at launching their own DSOs, some regional DSOs, and some sort of national DSOs. So I just sort of want to set the stage in terms of what the context of the current landscape looks like. So we certainly know that over the last probably 10 to 15 years, we've seen a decline in single doctor location, traditional private practice, so to speak, from about sort of 65, 68%, heading down by about 15% to close to 50% of the dental marketplace. And in that same time, we've seen DSO growth year on year of about 1.52%-ish. So it's depending on which data you look at, we're expecting DSOs to make up the majority of the dental market by capitalization by about 2025 and 2026. So not too long down the track where we expect to see the DSOs really controlling the majority of the marketplace in terms of capitalization and cash flow. So, you know, with that being said, you know, and this maybe is a good question for you, Chip, initially, is, you know, what kind of initial trends are you sort of seeing in the DSO world at the moment?
You know, the number of DSOs is growing exponentially. I can name 35 of them that have been formed this year. The larger ones are getting larger, and you've had a boom in specialty-only DSOs. So 5 years ago, there were no oral surgery-only DSOs, and today there are 15. 6 years ago, there was one ortho-only DSO, and today there are 13. So you've had a dramatic explosion in specialty DSOs, and that would be true for all of the specialties.
Wow. And I imagine you know, that's something you're also seeing to some degree, Brandon, in the sort of the way people are looking for finance, and, you know, perhaps the approaches that you're receiving from people that are perhaps interested in growing their own businesses as a group or doing their acquisitions. Is that sort of something that you're experiencing too?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been much more interest in people talking about how they'd like to grow from, you know, 2 to 10 to 20 offices very quickly. So we're seeing a lot of interest in folks growing to multiple offices in hopes to sell to a large DSO or to create their own. So we're definitely seeing a large influx in that.
So, I mean, and I think it's really a good point to share that, you know, are you beginning to see sort of an inflection point in the level of interest from, you know, traditional private practice to sort of growth into groups or DSOs, or is it still, you know, from your perspective at least, more the private single doctor or private single location interest?
I mean, we're seeing an array of it. Obviously, the folks that are coming to us are usually people looking to buy their first practice or maybe expand to their 10th. We're not getting phone calls from people who have 50, 60 offices already. So we're probably missing out on a lot of that information. But what we are seeing a lot of is, non-doctor owners partnering with doctor owners to then create, a business plan to scale, to have multiple offices, again, in hopes to maybe sell to a larger DSO or private equity.
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing up that point about private equity, and I think it is an important point. And a lot of people, a lot of my clients say and have perhaps a misconception that all DSOs are private equity backed, and in my experience, that's not necessarily the case. I guess in your experience, perhaps is that something you're seeing, Chip?
No, doctors seem to think that the only backers of group dentistry are private equity groups, and that's not true. We've done $300 million of transactions with non-private equity backed DSOs in the last 12 months. So you have private equity, certainly they are one of the largest backers of DSOs. But in addition, you have family offices, you have sovereign wealth fund. For instance, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Abu Dhabi just became an investor in a large DSO. You also have venture capitalist groups, which are typically doing startup deals and are now building DSOs. And then on top of that, you have other government-backed groups, which are interested in backing DSOs.
Well, I mean, that's incredible information that you shared, and I really appreciate that. And perhaps, with some knowledge now of what the typical backing options for a DSO looks like, would you mind sharing with the audience what the typical process is, just in very, very broad terms, of what a transaction might look like?
Well, we categorize DSOs in two separate, distinct categories. The branded DSOs, who are interested in acquiring 100% of a practice, rebranding it, having the doctor work for some number of years, and then transition out. So that's what I call a traditional DSO. The big growth is coming in the invisible DSOs. These are groups that you would have never heard of because they don't rebrand their practices, and the doctors remain as owners in the practices for years or decades. And the reason you've seen such a massive growth in the invisible DSOs versus the branded DSOs is the basic math says that when you have a practice where you have an owner operator, even if he's a minority owner, that practice is going to produce better results than an employee doctor in a practice. So you've had dramatic growth in the silent partners, as I call them, the invisible DSOs.
So how many sort of invisible DSOs would you say are actively seeking dental practice partners?
Over 200.
And then was that sort of a fairly national situation, or is it more regional?
No, it's very national. There are now invisible DSOs in all 50 states. We have clients today in Alaska, Honolulu, Maine. We've sold multiple practices in Montana and Wyoming. No, it is truly national now. There is no area that is untouched by the invisible DSOs. Now, you may not know that they're there because they come in as a silent partner, and things don't change in the practice from a patient's viewpoint, but they're there.
Yep. Oh, okay. That's really interesting. A really good point. And perhaps, if we sort of take a step back into what the transaction might look like, certainly one part of it is understanding and setting what your acquisition criteria might look like, or your growth criteria. Certainly you can grow through acquisition, or you can grow through a de novo kind of a model. So, in your experience, Chip, what would you say are the key features of the most valuable practices that you're seeing in transactions?
Really the number one driver of value today, besides the operating earnings or the profit of the practice, is the growth rate and the age of the doctor. We're seeing a dramatic reduction in the age of doctors that are doing these transactions. In March alone, we did $51 million of transactions for doctors under the age of 40, which you would have never heard 3 or 4 years ago. So, the transactions are all different, but in a traditional, or what we call a traditional invisible DSO transaction, the doctor is going to sell anywhere between 50 and 90% of the practice for cash up front. They're going to retain ownership in the balance, and that ownership may be in their new parent. It may be at the practice level. or it may be at a combination of both. But the mutual goal of both the doctor and their new silent partner is what resources can the new partner bring to help that practice grow bigger, better, faster, more profitably. And those resources will be all over the map, but today recruiting resources are a very valuable thing. The capital to expand is a valuable addition, but they can do a lot of good things for a practice, and they do it in the background. They're not there to micromanage the practice or tell you who to hire, who to fire, when to be open, what payers to take. They're very hands-off investors.
Okay. Well, yeah, thank you for sharing. And thank you for sort of bringing the point up that we have, silent investors versus sort of people that are looking for operating sort of majority control. Once we've sort of identified what our growth criteria is and what our practice acquisition criteria is, certainly one of the next stages is to look at how we're going to fund that acquisition. And certainly we have a few different options for funding. We've got private equity, which we've sort of discussed earlier. Your sovereign wealth funds. You've got your venture capital, and obviously more traditional lending. And Brandon, in your experience, what does a traditional lender or debt financing look like?
Or purchasing someone out to grow,
to grow or to purchase somebody out in terms of how someone might grow. It's like a single practice, or maybe they're looking to grow to 10 practices. What's the difference in how
Sure.
a lender might look at those two different situations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you're, looking to buy your first, the parameters, while they might be the same from going from 1 to 2 and then maybe up 2 to 10, there's going to be some additional parameters as you grow and you purchase more practices. I'd say some of the advice I give, because each lender is going to have a little bit different criteria, is one, get with a banker and tell them your plan. Not just that you're looking to purchase a practice, but how many you're looking to purchase and how fast you're looking to purchase them. Give them your end goal. If you go to somebody and ask them, hey, I'd like to purchase this practice, and then in a year you're looking to purchase another one, and in another year another one, and then this banker didn't realize you're looking to have 10 offices in 10 years or so, it might not be the right fit. So definitely get with a lender that can explain how they can get you to your end goal, right? So that's definitely number one, because they're going to have different guidelines. Some of these guidelines will be the same across the board, which is understanding the cash flow, making sure there's enough income to support your debt, both on the business and personal side. Of course, having, excellent credit. But some of the extra parameters and guidelines that, we would look for when maybe you're going from office number 4 and then explaining a plan to 10 is, what type of contracts are you going to have with these associates that you've hired? How do you plan on keeping them on board? Are you going to give them a little bit of ownership to, keep them there so that they don't leave? Because obviously you can't work at 10 offices at the same time, or even once a week. What type of management team are you going to have in place? We really want to understand who's going to be managing these other offices. Help them understand, liquidity. How much liquidity do you think you should have for the debt you're going to have? Making sure that they're able to pay down the debt fast enough in order to get more, so that you're not leveraged. So, those are a few tips to help on how you, go about scaling.
Okay, that's a great point.
Brandon, in our conversation yesterday, you pointed out you thought it was important that each practice was, or each office was, its own standalone legal entity, which I thought was really illuminating.
Yeah, that's really so that when we're going and looking at all of them, it's easy to analyze each individually. It helps us make sure that each one's stable. It also helps us in case, maybe they don't need that one. Maybe they'd like to sell it because that area isn't the right area for that practice and it doesn't fit the business model. And they didn't realize that market or that demographic that they opened up in, became what it is, present day. So maybe they do need to sell it and there's a better owner. So by having, separate entities for each, it's going to be a lot easier for a lender to come in and analyze, review, and purchase it. It's also going to help with lien positions. If there was one entity and quite a few loans, it would have a lien on all those entities or all those locations and that one entity. And so when a lender goes to lend money on this practice you're trying to get rid of, it's going to be difficult to unwind all of that. So it just helps with organization, certainly.
Yeah. And I think you sort of, I have clients that like to grow through acquisition models, and I have clients that like to grow and scale through de novos. From the perspective of a traditional lender or a specialist lender, perhaps, is there any difference in how you approach those particular sort of growth models?
Sorry, you're cutting out right there. Could you repeat that?
I'm sorry. Is there any difference in how you approach, how you assess a DSO or a group that's looking to grow through de novo versus through acquisition-based growth?
Yeah, a little bit. It depends on how many offices they already have, right? So if we are looking at somebody who has 10 offices already, it's going to look fairly similar on how we assess to lend them more money, whether to buy or start a practice. If they're going to start a practice, obviously we'll look for some sort of a business plan, but consider they have a very proven model. We're going to spend more time analyzing that model, those offices, the cash flow, all the normal bank metrics to lend them money for a startup. And it's going to be fairly similar for an acquisition if they're buying a practice too, because what they've done already is going to be much larger than what they're buying. Now, we're going to want to analyze the practice that they're buying and make sure it meets normal metrics such as stable revenues. Hopefully they're increasing, proper profit margins, everything you look for in kind of a normal acquisition. But again, if this person or this doctor already has 10 locations and 10 offices, analyzing those is going to be far greater than the one they're looking to buy, right? Because that's going to show that they've got the wherewithal, for the new debt, regardless of how the practice is doing right now. Now, it's a little different if it's their second office. We'll spend a lot more time analyzing that second office, going from 1 to 2, right? So it really does depend on, what the current situation is.
Oh, okay. Thanks for sharing. And I guess, now that we've sort of got some idea of what sort of financing options might look like in terms of, traditional finance versus specialist lending groups like Panacea, and, different private equity or venture capital models, I guess that the next stage in our transaction is to go through a due diligence phase and get an appropriate valuation. And, I guess one of the questions that I have interest in is, Chip, have you seen any change in practice values or any impact on practice values since COVID's come around or come and gone or stayed with us?
There have been a lot of changes. When COVID first hit and the practices were shut down, there was a lot of consternation, obviously, and everyone really thought that the acquisition market would dry up, and actually the opposite happened, because these groups needed to continue to add practices to their invisible DSOs, and so they actually became more aggressive. We did more transactions in 2020 than we did in 2019. And part of that was because the buyers created, and we helped them create, what was called a COVID earnout. And the COVID earnout basically said, we're going to do a transaction in 2020 or 2021 based on your last 12 months of profitability, which we know was hit during the shutdown and the rebuilding, so to speak. But with the COVID earnout, functionally, they repriced the transaction 1 year after closing, and sometimes 2 and sometimes 3 years after closing, so that the doctor was able to grow back to his pre-COVID earnings numbers and get paid for it as a part of the transaction. So since then, we've seen, I would guess, and it depends on the category, depends on the size of the practice, depends on the location. The interest in geographies has changed dramatically. Certain areas of the country were damaged more by COVID. Certain specialty types were damaged more by COVID. But for instance, in oral surgery, we've seen about a 20% increase in the value of oral surgery practices in the last 18 months. Ortho, we've seen something similar. Larger GP groups in the right locations. Let's call it Florida, Atlanta, Nashville, Dallas, Phoenix, Denver. In essence, as the population is migrating out of certain areas to other areas, where a practice is today has a bigger impact on its value than it did 2 years ago.
You mentioned that there were some specialists or specialty types that had outsized impact. Would you mind sharing which ones they were?
Well, for example, during the shutdown, the endodontists continued to provide emergency care, as did the oral surgeons. And so they became more attractive to the multi-specialty groups. The orthodontists were also attractive because the way their payment plans are set up for patients, the orthodontists continued to have strong cash flow even though their offices were not open. Whereas the GP practices that had to shut down, their cash flow was damaged considerably. And that carried through not just from the individual practices, but to the DSOs. So a group that was 500 offices of GP practices who was shut down for 60 or 90 days had significant cash flow problems and impacted their ability to acquire practices. And so some of the biggest GP focused groups bought nothing for about 16 months. So it's had an interesting impact across the spectrum, but overall values today for every practice are higher than they were pre-COVID. Not just because their earnings have recovered, but frankly, because there are more bidders eager to get into dental consolidation than there were 2 years ago.
Oh, wow. And Brandon, from a I guess a lender's perspective, have you noticed any sort of, does that sort of mirror your experience with practice values being impacted by COVID?
So from the acquisition deals that we've seen, we have seen an increase in the values. We try to analyze the markets and understand why the value may be higher. Talking with the practice broker, really understanding why it may be listed higher, and it does have to do with like what Chip said, the areas, some areas that have a high population growth. They're more sought after. I mean, like myself, I live south of Austin, Texas. I think we all know that there's been a huge, huge population growth there. And so practices are definitely going for a premium, and it's back to your original supply and demand. So if there's one office in this one wonderful area and it's the only one that's being sold for $1 million and it's doing $1 million in revenue in a nice area in Austin, they're probably going to get what they're asking for, because there's a lot of people moving from the East Coast and the West Coast that would like to buy that. So we have to recognize that. Obviously within policy and banks policy, you can only lend so much, right? But you can make exceptions to lend more in certain circumstances. So we try to look to understand if we should lend more to this because of that. But it's a moving target, and we have to kind of roll with it and understand it. And at the end of the day, for us, we want to just make sure that the customer, the applicant with us, is going to be able to pay back the loan. So the difference could be a matter of $50,000. It could be a matter of $200,000. To change it from maybe something that's priced what you consider normal now or high. It could be a small dollar amount. So we try to be flexible to make those deals. But yeah, definitely seeing an increase in a lot of areas. Those markets you talked about are them.
Okay. And Brandon, we actually have a question from one of our audience members for you.
Sure.
They want to know, why is it so different, or I guess why is the level of scrutiny placed so different going from one office to two offices? Is it because the doc can't be at two places at once, so they don't have as much security for the doc to be able to work with his hands to pay back the loan?
So I wouldn't say there's more scrutiny. What I would say is it's just looked at differently. So imagine you have 10 offices doing 10 million in revenue and you have 4 million in debt. The income coming out of that 10 million is going to be enough to obviously cover that 4 million in debt, plus quite a bit more. If you have one office, and mind you, let's just say this is a single doctor office, okay, not multiple specialty, not a really large office, but you've been there for 3 or 4 years, single doctor practice, and you're looking to go buy another one. Well, there's a couple big differences. Number one, the one with 10 offices has the experience of not only managing multiple offices, but growing and scaling. So they have that experience. It's already taken place. So that's comforting. The second thing is they have experience with employees, importantly associates coming and going, right? Some of them are on, they've stayed for a long time. Maybe they had some that were on for a little bit and quit, but this person has been able to kind of weather the storm through those associates coming and going. The person going from 1 to 2, maybe they have never, hired an associate to work for them. Maybe they don't have anybody at their existing office. So that part is going to get analyzed a little heavier. The first practice, you may have a little bit of debt and you're going to go, buy a practice, let's say equal the size. So the amount of debt you're going to get on a percentage basis is going to be a lot higher than if you have 10 offices and you're buying one, right? Your growth is 10%, right? In size, essentially. In this, it could be an increase of almost 100% growth. So there's a lot more moving targets and leverage calculations that come into play. But the advice I would give you if you're going, from 1 to 2 is if you can have the associate already there working at your existing practice, someone that's stable, explain why they're good, why they're going to stay on, and free up your time so that when you go to your banker, you can say, look, I already have 3 days a week free. This office is running stable. I have Dr. So-and-so working here. That's going to really help them get comfortable with approving for that second office. So it's always been tough just from 1 to 2. 2 to 3, 3 to 4 is just a little bit easier because you have the experience managing multiple offices. So I hope that answers the question.
Yep. Well, I think you make a lot of great points there, and it makes sense according to our audience member. They say thank you for your answer. And I would add to that, I think one of the key things people look for is, in my experience at least, a replicable model. So going from 1 to 2, you really don't have a proven model which you can replicate. Going from 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 10, 10 to 40, you actually now have a model which, you can prove works and you can prove is actually sustainable in terms of, how you're growing. So it's a way of, I guess, in some ways de-risking the situation. So exactly. I guess perhaps to return to the flow and the process of what the transaction might look like. So we're going through our due diligence now. Are there any specific due diligence issues that people need to look out for in your experience, Chip?
Yeah, it's really important that doctors have what I'll call clean accounting. The accounting systems that we see and the accountants that we see sometimes can be very challenging and can break deals. You need to have clean, up-to-date financial statements that preferably the doctor understands. We see a lot of doctors who do not know their numbers very well, and that's not a good thing. That's not a great way to run a practice. The great practice is the doctors know their numbers and follow their numbers. So when we talk to a doctor who we say, hey, we'd like to look at your current financials, we'd like to look at year-to-date 2022, and they say, yeah, I haven't done those yet, and it's June, that's a problem. So my number one piece of advice to doctors who, and this would probably be true for the lenders as well, is to make sure you have accurate, clean financials, and that you have a good accountant backing them up. Look at the nodding head. Right. You run into this more than once, I think.
Constantly. I'd like to add to that really quick, a good quick story if I could. I have somebody I'm working with right now who's looking to open their 6th office, and one of the great things about this doctor and their accountant is they have an ongoing note system on the P&L for each practice. So When you open up the Excel spreadsheet, you have the P&L, and there could be some odd expenses. You'll literally see notes to the right from the accountant with their name labeled. What was this? Or the doctor explaining exactly what that is. So when I get these financials and I'm looking through them, it's clear as day. And there is every little expense broken out, which is good because we can understand if some of these are not reoccurring. And there's one for each practice. On top of that, they create a new tab at the bottom that then goes into the debt, right? You've got your balance sheet that's there too, but then there's a tab on just the debt. When was it taken out? With what bank? What's the rate? Amortization table, everything. Is there a prepayment penalty? So I'm helping this person structure, and it is all right there, clear as day. Really, really easy. So highly recommend doing something like that. And this doctor, like you said, knew their numbers very, very, very well. But that's why this person's opening about an office a year or less right now. He's really doing a good job.
And I would bet that what you just described is very rare because we don't see that.
I think this is like the first, honestly, I hate to say it might be the first time
The unicorn.
that organized. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you both bring up really great points there, and making sure everything is clean, because, you know, although for the most part, most DSOs and other professional investors know what needs to be added back and to different costs, a lot of dental offices, as they currently sit, are structured in such a way that they're designed to show very, very minimal sort of net profit by hiding, well, perhaps not hiding, but by including some expenses of the owner into different it says we have no audio. Is that?
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Oh, I apologize, Reza. We seem to have audio, but
Yeah, we're fine with audio on our end here. For the,
oh, okay.
and we just got another comment that we can hear you. So
if
we're
I
good.
can make a comment on that, it is perfectly expected in every deal that there are going to be personal expenses that accidentally slip into the practice P&Ls. It is completely normal, and you're going to get to add them all back when calculating the practice's profit in a deal that we might do. The key is making sure you know what they are, because you're going to be able to add them back as long as you can justify them, to use the nice euphemism that Brandon used of non-recurring. And we have seen some very creative uses of personal expenses that accidentally slip into the P&Ls. Very creative.
Would you like to share one of those?
Oh, yeah, you have to share. You can't tell us like.
No, I will share one of the simple ones. We had a client in Chicago, and my analysts are really good at looking at ratios and what costs should be in a practice so that they can ferret out things that we might be able to add back. So this particular doctor's laundry expense for the uniforms for his team members was out of whack relative to his revenues. And so she asked the doctor about it, said, "Why is your laundry expense so high?" He said, "Oh, that $25,000, those are some custom suits that I bought." And so we were able to add those back as long as we provided the receipt to the buyer, so the buyer understood that it was non-recurring. And that was a deal worth 7 times EBITDA. So that finding that one little buried item added $175,000 in value to that particular practice. And it happens every day.
Those are some nice suits too, Chip.
Yeah, he was a stylish guy. He was an orthodontist. Okay. And for some reason, all orthodontists drive Teslas. Oral surgeons drive Mercedes, orthodontists drive Teslas.
Write that down.
Yes, we'll add that to our practice profiles. Type of car being driven. So it's really funny. Sorry. As sort of people are going through the due diligence process, how long should people expect that due diligence process to take, Brandon, in your experience?
The due diligence process to get approved?
To get approved, and from a lender's perspective, how long will they be or should they expect to wait to hear back from their lender, or how long should the lender typically take to assess what the lender wants from underwriting, etc.
Yeah.
And then perhaps after that, Chip, from an investor standpoint, what's the due diligence sort of length typically look like? So if you'd like to kick off, Brandon.
Yeah, sure. I'll make it quick. I mean, every lender is going to have a different kind of timeline. If you're working with a banker who's been doing this a long time, usually have a good conversation with that person, and they should be able to tell you, look, we will probably be able to get this approved, right? Somebody who's been doing this for a while. But unfortunately, some lenders they can take a long time, up to 60 days for an approval. Some maybe just a week. And it depends on the size too of the loan, depends on real estate. So there's a lot of factors, but I always say, like with scaling, with everything I talk about with my customers, is prepare. So start everything you can early and get those pre-approvals done sooner than later. Don't rush. So.
Okay, thank you. And I guess, Chip, once sort of financing has been secured, in your experience, what should people be expecting in terms of a typical due diligence or negotiation sort of length of time?
Typically it's somewhere between 45 and 90 days. It depends on the buyer, and again, it depends on the cleanliness of the doctor's books and records. And sometimes they can be messier than they should be. But our target is, from the time we come to an agreement between a buyer and a seller, we really would like to have that transaction due diligence and what's called the quality of earnings process, which is functionally a mini audit conducted by the buyer on the doctor's practice. We kind of like to have that done in 45 days. And again, bigger, messier transactions, it takes a lot longer. But you should be able to decide whether you're going to do a transaction or not, no longer than 60 days.
And could you perhaps explain to our audience, for those who may not know, what a QOE or quality of earnings looks like? Because that is certainly something I get asked on a regular basis by my clients.
Well, the quality of earnings is really a way for the invisible DSO management and their investors to cover their ass. So what they're doing is they're bringing in an outside third-party accounting firm to verify that the numbers that the doctor has provided and that, in theory, the DSO management has underwritten are actually real. And so they're going to go in and, in very minute detail, almost line by line through the ledgers, they're going to look at every I won't say every transaction, but they're going to look at a lot of transactions to test the validity of those transactions, and they're going to track the cash that was reported to be coming in, and did it actually get deposited. So they're going to match the bank statements to the receipts. It's a fairly detailed process, and it's not an inexpensive investment on the part of the buyers. A lot of people ask me, well, why don't these groups buy smaller practices? And the answer is because it's very expensive to do these transactions. An average invisible DSO transaction that we do, the buyer's probably spending over $200,000 on their legal, their due diligence, their QOE, their accounting.
And perhaps, Brandon, what's your experience in how long a transaction process would take from start to finish from a lender side?
Yeah, so the approval process, like I said, can vary, and it really depends on how fast all parties want to move, right? In the instance you have a lease space, there's going to be a landlord that's going to be involved. Sometimes landlords can take a while to just reply to emails. I mean, I'm dealing with one right now where it takes 1 week to get a reply. So hopefully we only ask a few questions, because it's a week per question. Sometimes they can't agree to terms. Sometimes the purchase agreements between the attorneys, they just don't agree when it gets there. So, I mean, it can take some time. I would say typically, though, it's about 90 days. I think 90 days is a fair assessment. Whether you're purchasing real estate with the practice or you're leasing space, 90 days seems to be about how long these things are taken. But there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of people involved. And sometimes at the 11th hour, people change their mind on some small items that are, really big to the other party. And you know, you can get back to the negotiating table. So I would aim for about 90 days, but err on the side of caution. Give yourself some more time.
I think you mentioned there are a lot of things that, you know, a lot of moving parts, and obviously there are a lot of things that can derail the transaction. You know, I guess from your experience, what are the biggest pitfalls that, you know, a buyer or a seller might need to avoid derailing this their transaction?
The seller?
Or buyer?
I mean, gosh, where do I start? There's sometimes a non-compete just by, you know, not wanting to do a non-compete. Maybe they have agreed on terms, and then the buyer goes to their lender, and the lender says the lease needs to be at least X amount of years, and the landlord's like, sorry, I don't want to do that. But they didn't foresee that coming because, again, these can be closing conditions. These can be things that aren't, you know, brought up in the beginning stages. What other items?
Perhaps Chip, do you have anything?
Insurances?
Yeah, I've got one that's really, you know, in our transactions, we usually have owner doctors who have multiple associates. And when it gets time to get close to doing a transaction, the buyers want the doctors to be able to assign the associate employment agreements to the new partner or the new buyer. And there's a lot of interesting negotiations that go into that, because the buyer does not want to buy the practice unless the associates are coming with it. And 99% of all of the associate contracts that we see with doctors cannot be assigned, even though nobody's trying to change the terms of the agreements. The buyer is willing to accept 100% of the terms of the associate agreements. And for the associate, they're getting a better, in essence, guarantor on their contract. But the associates then go, wait a minute, I'm not an owner. You're going to make a whole lot of money in this. I helped you build this. I'm not going to assign my contract to the buyer unless you pay me X. We call that the associate extortion attempt. And it comes up in at least half of our deals. So my advice to doctors is always make sure there's a provision in your associate agreement that says this associate agreement may be assigned without your permission.
Yeah, and if I could just—
You're nodding your head like you've seen this one.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, that's an amazing point. And from another side of the smaller transactions, because I know you're dealing with the larger buyers, I've been on the other side of the table where that associate has come to me to apply and then said, hey, Brandon, the deal's off. My seller looks like they want to sell to a DSO. They're getting a lot more money. And unfortunately, what happened was the seller had told this associate when they started, maybe, I'll sell you my practice in a few years, you know, kind of a normal transition. So of course, the associate's looking to do that. And then all of a sudden, here comes 3 times the money. The seller changes their mind, and then the associate's ready to just jump ship, obviously frustrated. But that is a very good example, especially right now.
We run into that a lot, but the way we address that is the buyers want the associates, and they want the associates to be happy because they're really important to the future performance of the practice. So we'll see cases where the buyers will actually grant the associates equity or finance the associates to buy in equity. All of these groups want the associates to become owners because that's the basic business philosophy of their whole concept, owner-operators of practices. So we usually can get around that because we run into that all the time. Right? With the associate who thought he was going to buy the practice, the doctor figures out it's not worth 80% of collections, it's worth 3 times collections. And so there have been multi-million-dollar cash payments. There's been equity granted at the parent company. There's a way to get around that. It's painful though.
Yeah, I think we'll start to see that those contracts change as this evolves because, you know, 4 years ago, it wasn't as prevalent.
Yeah, I agree.
It's certainly something that I'm also beginning to see, and this is perhaps a more recent, in the last 6 months, last 12 months, perhaps, in a broader labor sense, is that buyers are perhaps paying or putting more priority on sort of staff turnover that they're seeing in their acquisitions and what the staffing looks like versus what they've done in the past. Is that something that you're seeing reflected as well, Chip?
Yes, absolutely. I was at dinner last night with a buyer and a doctor in Philadelphia, and the buyer knew the doctor's turnover numbers to the day practically for all of their 40 staff members. That is something they're really looking at hard. They're looking at when the last raises were given to these teams, and when the next raises are due. We're seeing a lot of team extortion going on in practices where the 6 hygienists in a practice will come to the doctor and go, hey, we could all be making $8 an hour more, and unless you give us all $8 an hour more, we're all leaving en masse. It is classic extortion, but it's happening every day.
Yeah, and I absolutely have experienced that with some of my clients where a buyer's gone through the due diligence process, and halfway through the due diligence process, after what we thought terms were agreed were, the seller has decided to give all of his staff a raise. So I absolutely have seen that occur, and unfortunately, you're right. It seems to be occurring more and more. So I guess one of the things, and perhaps this is a good question for you, Brandon, we've seen sort of recent interest rate or cash rate rises by the Federal Reserve. What kind of impact do you think those might have on sort of acquisitions or practice values going forward?
I don't know if it's going to slow down the acquisitions. I think they're going to continue. There's a lot more buyers than there are sellers. I think people are rushing to get rates locked in. The Fed funds have gone up quite a bit this year, and they plan on almost doubling by the end of the year to, I think I've got it down as about 3.4% by the end of the year, and 3.8% by the end of 23, which it should level off and then start to come down. It says at the end of 24, we'll see. But I don't think it's going to slow anything down, honestly. The rates are going to go up another couple percent. We're raising our rates almost every month, it seems. But I think the demand is still there. These doctors are still trying to grow. If there's enough income to support the debt, then they will. But I think it's just more than anything, it's just frustrating for some. I think a lot of the younger doctors haven't seen high rates before in their lifetime, so they're shocked and think that rates in the 5s are astronomically high when we're not even close to high. So it'll be interesting. I can tell you that it hasn't slowed down for us at all. We're still booking quite a few loans, getting tons of applications. The public understands what's happening. And I think they're trying to get it done sooner than later.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Chip, I know we spoke and touched on earlier sort of different DSO models. One of the questions I get asked a lot about from my clients is this idea of the sub-DSO model. And I think in my experience, it's sort of gaining in popularity in terms of, using a bigger DSO's resources to help sort of de-risk yourself. Would you care to explain to some of our audience members, what the sub-DSO model really looks like?
They call it a lot of different things, whether it's sub-DSO or joint venture, but effectively, a doctor could sell 51%. The deals that we do are all, we'll call them control deals. The investors want 51%. Now that doesn't mean doctors don't have control, because ultimately doctors are the golden goose that lays the golden eggs. And without the doctors in the team, the buyer or the investor has bought nothing, right? Certainly you have beautiful lobby furniture and some wonderful artwork, but all they're buying is the people. So the doctors ultimately are not losing control. But in a sub-DSO or a JV model, the doctor might sell 51% of his practice or his group, retain 49% ownership at the practice level, and use his partner's capital to go out and either acquire or build de novos, and he would still own 49% of whatever he acquired or built. And some of these groups really can provide phenomenal resources to their sub-DSOs, or what we call more commonly their JV practices. But it's a great risk-free tool for doctors to build an empire without capital of their own or risk of their own.
And would you say you're seeing, at least in my experience, I'm seeing sort of an increase in interest in that particular model? Is that something that you're seeing as well?
It's been around for decades. It's not new. But yeah, we are seeing some increase in it.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing those experiences and those points. So I am sort of aware we're beginning to get close to time, and I think you guys have shared an amazing amount of information and experience. And I guess one thing I always like to ask our expert panels are, if our audience was to take away one thing today that you would want them to be able to implement and start doing in their businesses tomorrow, that will have a significant impact on what they do, what would that be? Would you like to kick off, Brandon?
Sure. There's quite a few things, but I think the number one thing that I'd like people to take away that are scaling, that are trying to grow, to 10 offices, 20 offices, let's say, is, like I mentioned originally, is find a lender that's going to be there for you for the life of that. Sit down with that banker and say, hey, I'd like to buy this practice, and then I'd like to buy, the next few. Are you able to take me there? Does your bank have a cap, right? If so, what is that? One of the most frustrating things is when somebody comes to me and has 5 offices and they have 5 loans with 4 different banks. They may not even know that they're in default in some of those because they went and got other debt, but we can't help them because of the size of the prepayment penalties. And these are some fantastic dentists that are growing, and we would like to. So I would say, as part of the preparation, don't just talk about it in your business plan the initial stages, how you're going to grow your office, why your office is going to be so successful. Talk about the middle part of this, and then the end. Like, how far are we going? How many practices, would you like to have? And then really get a good game plan with the right banker, so that you're not setting yourself up for failure. So just ask those questions, and the banker should be able to walk you through how they get you to 10 offices and exactly how that works. If they cannot, and they're not sure, and they're going to go talk to credit, then have them come back and explain it. If they still can't, talk to another banker, but find somebody who can sit down and literally walk you through from memory, soup to nuts, on getting to 10 offices.
Oh, those are great points. A plan is super important. And Chip, do you have any sort of takeaways that you would like our audience to start implementing tomorrow?
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to reiterate the accounting, because that is number one. And number two, if you're thinking about doing a transaction with anybody, you should consider all of your options. The DSOs love to go directly to the doctors, romance the doctors, make them an offer, and steal their practices. We see it all the time. Any great practice that is going to qualify to partner with one DSO could probably have 10 bidders. And they should look at all of their options, because each of these groups are very different, not only in the values that they would assign to a transaction, but in how they operate the practices after a transaction. And anybody who has a great practice is going to have multiple bidder options, and they should look at all of their options.
Oh, great points there, Chip. Thank you for sharing.
On behalf of CareStack and Darby, I want to thank Chip and Brandon for a tremendous program this evening. Hendrik is showing the contact information for Chip on the screen there, and also for Brandon. And maybe you want to just drop it into the chat feature too as well.
Will do.
Andrew, anything for our attendees in closing here?
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us, and especially our presenters this evening. This was some very valuable information, and some information I hadn't heard before. There was some wonderful gems that you shared, and the examples. I could listen to you for another hour or two, because I really learned so much. So thank you for being so generous with
Thank you all for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. And a big thank you to Hendrik for concluding this series. We've had so much good feedback. Maybe, I'm sure we'll find a way to reprise Hendrik in this role, right? He's like the famous rock star. We'll get him back out for a future appearance here soon.
It's been my pleasure.
Well, have a nice evening. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a good evening. Take care.
Bye.
Appreciate your time.
Bye.